Hi there, friends. Welcome back to the Fireside Storyteller. I'm so glad you could join me today. Today, I would like to speak directly to the parents, teachers, and adults who may actually listen to the Fireside Storyteller. First, let me suggest that this video is not a story. It's more like a story about the stories. May I also suggest that this may not necessarily be suitable for our youngest listeners. You know, I've been thinking about something that as I prepare these stories for you each week. Have you ever noticed how incredibly dark and gruesome some of these tales actually are? I mean, seriously, we're talking about stories with child abandonment, murder, cannibalism, and even all sorts of other things that you'd never make it into a children's book today. Take Alibaba, for instance. If you've watched the movie, you'll remember the magical phrase, "Open sesame," but forget that the story includes a man being drawn and quartered and sewn back together. Thieves are hidden in oil jars who get boiled alive, and a servant girl who stabs a man while dancing. And we tell this to our kids. Or think about sweet Hansel and Gretel. Their parents, their actual parents, decided to abandon them in the woods to starve. Not once, but twice. And the children, they meet a witch who literally wants to eat them, and they end up shoving her into an oven to be burned alive. So, what's going on here? Why are these beloved tales so incredibly grim? Let's talk about that a little bit today. Here's the thing. These stories weren't created in our world with grocery stores and street lights and antibiotics. They came from a time when life was incredibly harsh in ways we can barely imagine. Picture this, if you will. If you were living in medieval Europe, winter is coming. Your crops didn't do so well this year because there was too much rain. There's simply not enough food to last until spring. Disease is everywhere. A simple cut could kill you if it gets infected. And they didn't even understand the concept of infected. They just understood that it got very sick. Half the children in your village won't live to see their 10th birthday. The darkness outside your door isn't just metaphorical. It's literally pitch black once the sun goes down, filled with very real dangers from animals to bandits. The world was genuinely scary. So these stories, they weren't just entertainment. They were survival guides disguised as bedtime stories. When parents told their kids about Hansel and Gretel, they were acknowledging something the children probably already knew, that during the famines, impossible choices had to be made. There are actual historical accounts from the Great Famine of 1315 where families couldn't feed all their children. This is pretty grim stuff. But notice something. Notice how the story doesn't end with the abandonment. It continues to show how the children survive through cleverness and looking out for each other. The message isn't, parents are terrible. The message is that even in the worst situations, you can find a way through. So, let's look at some examples. Let's dig into some of these dark stories a bit more. They're actually pretty fascinating when you think about what they're really saying. In Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, our hero, Alibaba, discovers a secret cave where thieves store their stolen goods. And what does he do? He steals some for himself. So, that's not exactly a moral compass, right? Well, his brother Kasim gets kind of greedy. He goes to the cave and he ends up caught by the thieves. And in the original version, they actually quarter him into 4 pieces and blood dripping as a warning to others. When the thieves come looking for him, his servant, Morgiana, kills them by pouring boiling oil into jars where they're hiding. And then he stabs the leader while she's performing a dance for him. That's pretty brutal. But here's the thing. In a world without police or reliable law enforcement, stories like this taught a different kind of justice. The message was about survival and loyalty in a dangerous world. Morgiana isn't portrayed as violent. She's clever and brave, protecting her household from the genuine threats. When I tell this story, I focus on the cleverness and less on the graphic details. But the core lesson about facing threats with courage and wits, it remains important. So let's talk about the Brothers Grimm. The Grimm brothers, they collected their stories in the early 1800s, but many of these stories date back centuries earlier. And oh boy, they are dark. Take Snow White. Her stepmother doesn't just dislike her. She orders a huntsman to cut out Snow White's heart and bring it back as proof of her death. In the original ending, the evil queen is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies. We generally leave that out, right? You may not have even known it. Cinderella's stepsisters cut off parts of their feet trying to fit in a glass slipper, and birds peck out their eyes at the wedding. What about Rapunzel? The witch discovers she's been meeting with the prince when Rapunzel accidentally mentions that her clothes are getting a little bit tight around her waist, implying, well, that's not exactly the Disney version. What's fascinating is how many of these stories involve stepmothers and stepfamilies. This wasn't random. In an era when childbirth commonly killed women, remarriage was often necessary for survival. Blended families with competing interests were incredibly common. So these weren't just scary stories. They reflected very real tensions over resources, inheritance, and survival. So Hans Christian Andersen is a little bit different. He was a master of emotional pain. While the Grimm brothers focused on physical danger, Hans Christian Andersen specialized in emotional suffering. And honestly, sometimes that hits even harder, don't you think? For example, in The Ugly Duckling, the poor little guy isn't just rejected by strangers. His own mother says he's too big and strange, which I changed to be a caring mother, and wishes he'd never been hatched. The other ducks bite him, chickens beat him, and even humans kick him away. Then he considers letting himself freeze to death because, quote, it would be easier than this suffering, which I also left out, by the way. You really feel the weight of that rejection. And let's talk about The Little Mermaid. The real version, not the Disney one, our mermaid falls in love with a prince and he trades her voice for human legs. But every step feels like walking on sharp knives. Despite her sacrifice and her pain, the prince marries someone else. She's given a knife to kill him and to save herself, but instead, she throws herself into the sea and dissolves into foam. That's the happy ending. She dissolves into foam. And Andersen doesn't give her any spiritual chance of an afterlife, which is a significant thing, particularly to the people of that time. These stories weren't just about scaring kids. They acknowledged real emotional pain in a world where conformity was often necessary for survival, and personal desires frequently had to be sacrificed for family or community needs. Now, not all cultures told stories the same way. It's pretty interesting to see how different cultures approached their traditional tales. Not everyone went as dark as the European storytellers. Many Native American legends focus on explaining natural phenomenon and teaching harmony with nature rather than warnings about human dangers. The Iroquois, creating stories of the Sky Woman, brings life to a new world. Coyote tales show the trickster facing humiliation for his scheme, but rarely death. The African Anansi spider tells stories which usually let the tricking spider face funny consequences for his schemes without the harsh punishments you see in the European tales. He might get outsmarted or embarrassed, but he lives to trick another day. Japanese folklore definitely has some creepy elements with their yokai spirits, but they tend to emphasize respecting the unknown rather than the graphic justice we see in our Western stories. But this makes me wonder if the harshness of the European tales reflects something specific about the historical conditions there. The brutal winters, the frequent wars, the plagues and famines that shaped their worldview. So how do we find the right balance today? This leaves me with a question I think about a lot as the Fireside Storyteller. How do I handle these tales today? Have we gone too soft, protecting our kids from difficult truth the ancestors thought essential? Or were these original tales unnecessarily harsh for today's world? I think it's about finding a middle ground. Our kids face different dangers than wolves in forests or witches in candy houses. We find these tales as imaginative tales. But today's threats might be online predators, peer pressure, or maybe complex social challenges of growing up in a digital and a chaotic world. When I tell these stories, I try to preserve their wisdom while softening the edges that might be too sharp for modern sensibilities. And maybe I'll ask questions that might be more relevant to today's trials. Lessons about courage, resourcefulness, consequences, and kindness especially are still incredibly valuable. I might tone down the graphic violence in Alibaba, which I have, but I keep the tension and the triumph of cleverness over brute force. And when I tell Hansel and Gretel, which I did, I focus on the children's ingenuity and bravery rather than the dwelling on abandonment. The heart of the story is its emotional truth and wisdom. It remains intact even when we adjust some of the harsher details. You know, I love telling these stories. These stories of yesteryear are a lot like this fire we're gathered around. Fires provide warmth and light, but they can also burn if we're not careful with them. Our ancestors lived closer to real physical danger than most of us do today, but their love for their children showed not by shielding them from darkness, but by preparing them to face it with courage and wisdom. So today, we can afford to soften some of these sharper edges, but I think there is definitely value in preserving the shadows that give these stories their depth, not to frighten, but to honor the full range of the human experience and the wisdom passed down through generations. I invite you to continue exploring these timeless tales together with me. As I read and ponder each one before I present this, I will adapt each story for our modern audience. I invite you to look for both the light and the shadow, understanding that both have their purpose. The courage, the kindness, the resilience that shines all brighter against the darkness that frames them. As you listen to these stories, as you use your imagination and our children use their imagination, I encourage you to drop comments in each story with me. Share your lessons and experiences. Stories are the legacy of our culture. So what do you think? Were the stories that scared you as a kid but taught you something valuable? Or did the tales go a little too far? Again, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hey, if you're enjoying the Fireside Storyteller, our little fireside chats, don't forget to join the Storyteller's Magic Circle. It's at facebook.com/Fireside Storyteller. This is where I share my personal thoughts about the stories, and you can join me. You might say it's our story behind the stories. So, until the next time, let's keep your fire burning bright and your stories close to your heart. I'll see you again.